Hi folks. Today we're going to have a look at whether the UN is fit or unfit for purpose. Okay, so what we'll be looking at is the structure of the UN as an entire institution. We'll be looking at what it was set up to do. So we'll take a quick look at its founding charter, and then we'll look at some of the broader arguments for and against whether it is effectively fulfilling those functions as set out in Article 1. Okay. So a quick reminder, just exactly what we mean by the UN. This is our structure, and in many ways it mirrors those institutions of a national government, right? It has its General Assembly, which is its legislature. It has its courts, the ICJ, the ICC, which very much mirror a judiciary. And then it has a slightly weird, almost bicameral-esque executive, a mix of the Secretary General, which is very much what we would consider the figurehead of the United Nations. And then we have the Security Council with those 5 permanent members: China, Russia, France, the US, and the UK, along with 10 non-permanent members, which all serve 2-year terms and represent the various unrepresented continents there, most primarily Southeast Asia, um, South America, and Africa. So that is kind of what we're looking at. Now, when we're thinking about actually the functions of the UN and really whether it fulfills those functions, for much of it, we're only really going to be looking at the Security Council. There is a little element of the ICJ and the ICC in there, and partly the General Assembly. But really, when we look at actually implementing things and on the ground action, it's primarily the Security Council that do that, along with some other institutions. Okay. So when you get a question on this, don't be afraid to focus on the Security Council, but just make sure that you are mentioning other areas as well. Okay, so when we look at some arguments for and against, we're going to be looking at things like the United Nations Development Programme, we'll be looking at ECOSOC, we'll be looking a little bit at the ICC and the ICJ as well. Okay, we may also stray into a little bit of the UNFCCC. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, just thinking a little bit more about the functions of the UN, let's actually think about what it was set up to do. Because remember, the UN is not a form of world governance. It is not a single world government. It is not even a supranational organization. So sometimes a lot of critics of the UN often go too far and say, well, it doesn't do anything. But what you have to remember is this is intergovernmental. It is designed to let states resolve conflict for themselves, not order states about and tell them what to do. And whenever I think of the purposes of the UN, I always go back to this quote from the second UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, who, on his address to the General Assembly, famously said, "The UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell." So there we go. It's not designed to solve every world problem, but it is designed to make the world a slightly better place. So let's actually think about that when we're evaluating the UN and give it a little bit of a fair shake without saying, well, there's still conflict, there's still poverty, there's still war, there's still nuclear weapons, and say, well, in that case, it's failed. Because in a lot of ways, that's absolving states of responsibility for their own slightly dodgy actions. But let's actually explore what it was set up to do in just a little bit more detail. Let's consider its functions in reference to Article 1 of the UN Charter. Now, in terms of an essay, I would personally base my for and against points around these 4 areas, using some of the arguments and examples to kind of almost critique whether these have been successfully upheld or not. So what we're really focusing on, well, does the UN maintain international peace and security? Has conflict decreased? How are citizens better protected since the UN has been created? And again, that really comes under the purview of the Security Council. The second one is to develop friendly relations among nations. Does it help foster those close relationships? Is it a forum for states to meet with one another and come together and decide on a global rules-based system, such as things like an international system of morality. Okay, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights would be a perfect example of that, and we'll critique that in a second. Thirdly, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems. Does it allow for cooperative action? Does it allow states to come together and make decisions on collective security dilemmas and resolve to follow one centralized path, one centralized solution problem? And for those things, we're going to be thinking about nuclear disarmament. We're going to be thinking about terrorism. We're going to be thinking about poverty and climate change. Okay, and really that rolls into that final one, to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. Does it make sure that states are all working towards a global goal? And if not, what can it do to kind of correct those actions of states? Okay, so thinking a little bit more broadly about those things, let's actually have a look at some of the arguments for and against. So let's start off by thinking about that the UN is unfit for purpose, because most people argue this is the default position. It goes back to the idea we still have war, we still have poverty, we still have nuclear weapons, we still have terrorism, and the climate is not getting any better. Therefore, it has failed in its mission. So let's actually think about some of the underpinning reasoning behind that. Well, first of all, one of the primary arguments is that it's outdated. Most primarily people point to the outdated nature of the P5. Russia, the US, France, UK, China having that structural advantage within the UN, which allows them arguably to facilitate their own interests above the interests of the global community. But also there are increasing arguments that they are no longer the major powers in the international system. Remember that more recently we've had the growing discontentment of the G4. That would be Brazil, India, Japan, and Germany, who all argue because of their economic or military power, they also deserve a seat on the P5 as well, making it the P9. So there's a lot of criticisms there that the UN is an outdated institution of neo-colonial proportions, i.e. West knows best. And, with the rise of BRIC nations, there's a serious challenge to that. Our second critique is this idea of the permanent veto, also still very much within the remit of the Security Council. But the argument again is that the ideological divide in the Security Council divided between the Western Bloc, so the US, the UK and France, and the Eastern Bloc, China and Russia, lead to an ideological intransigence, that the tensions within that council can often lead to conflict or crises being ignored, or in the case of the Syrian civil war, exacerbated. And also, as a result of that intransigence, it encourages states to use unilateral action and as such circumvent the UN, kind of rendering it impotent really, so that it can't really do anything. And then thirdly, I would argue probably one of the biggest weaknesses of the UN is this lack of enforcement power. The continued challenges of the Westphalian state system means that really there is very little the UN as an institution can do to force states to act. And, this kind of comes from two centers. Yes, that concept of state sovereignty, but also the physical idea that the UN has no standing army, which means responses to crises have often been called inadequate. Nowhere was that more kind of apparent than during the Srebrenica massacre in the Bosnian Civil War, where Dutch peacekeepers were forced to stand by while Bosnian men and boys were slaughtered. Okay, and another part of this is that lack of a standing army often also means it relies on states to enforce its decisions. Primarily, those members of the P5 are often the ones most expected to put up troops for peacekeeping missions. And resulting from that, it helps to enforce this hierarchy. It helps to keep that structural advantage of those P5 members. And then finally, one thing that we do have to look at is that previous reforms have failed to solve issues. Particularly in the 1960s and the 1970s, we saw an attempt to make elements of the UN more representative. So in 1965, the UN Security Council was expanded. It added 4 temporary members to the 10 that we know now to give greater representation, particularly to states such as Africa. In the 70s as well, we saw a increase in the ECOSOC membership to now include representatives from 54 member states. But ultimately, because of that, the problems of the P5, it's failed to kind of readdress that kind of imbalance. And therefore, we can argue that the UN, one of the primary arguments that it's unfit for purpose based on that previous reform argument, is that it has arguably become a vehicle for the state interest of the most powerful nations, primarily the US over the past sort of 30 years. Although there is an argument to say that maybe that is changing. Increasingly, it's being used as a vehicle for Russian and Chinese interests, although that's something that we kind of need to be a bit careful about before we generalize too much. However, let's be a little bit more positive and let's consider how the UN is fit for purpose. Well, first of all, the UN Security Council remains this powerful forum. Yes, it is intransigent, but it has helped to maintain peace and security around the world. Remember that quote from Steven Pinker, the idea that we are now living the most peaceful time in human history. And again, let's qualify that quote. Pinker was talking about a much wider set of changes in the international system, which has helped to keep peace, but the Security Council is almost certainly part of that. So it is an important way of not only helping to resolve conflict, but also deterring states from entering into conflict, knowing that intervention from the Security Council is a real possibility. And one of the really good examples of that would be on a border dispute between Burkina Faso and Mali. There was a ruling there with the ICJ that ruled in Mali's favour, and it was respected because the enforcement mechanism of that was an intervention from the UN Security Council. So we do see the fact that in some cases it is fit for purpose. Furthermore, we have seen it establish a rules-based system and a universal morality of sense. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights has been vital in establishing a morality in which all states are judged by. It can't always be enforced. And, that is the realpolitik of the situation, is state interest is always going to get in the way of enforcement, as we've seen in the case of the Syrian civil war or in the case of the Saudi war in Yemen. We see that that state interest can get in the way, but what it has done is it's created a moral standard by which all states are judged. And over recent years, that has been chipped away at more. The passage of responsibility to protect has made state sovereignty conditional upon the adherence to the UDHR, which is a real challenge, at least in theoretical terms, to the Westphalian state system. So that is a real kind of strength there. Thirdly, what we have to see is we've seen some real action on collective security dilemmas. Action on poverty particularly is really one of the big successes of the UN, set out as one of the key targets of the Millennium Development Goals back in 2000. Since then, we've seen 1.9 billion people lifted out of poverty. That's a roughly 50% halving of the absolute poverty rate internationally, which is a huge effort, and that's been done through coordinated efforts with the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the United Nations Development Programme, and UNICEF. So that was a real collective action of all of the different committees and organisations within the UN. Now, that is still an ongoing process. The UN itself acknowledges that much of that has been in Asia, primarily in China, and much more needs to be done in sub-Saharan Africa, but still nearly 2 billion people in just over 2 decades is a pretty big win. Recently as well, let's talk about action on climate change. The framework established by the UNFCCC, has helped to coordinate action and set ambitious targets for tackling climate change, most recently in the Paris Climate Agreement, and is now up for renewal in the Glasgow Paris Climate Conference, or also known as COP26, which was supposed to take place in November 2020, but because of the coronavirus pandemic has now been pushed back to November 2021. And really, although obviously the action on climate change is an ongoing issue, there is an argument that the coordination of targets around climate change has really shown this idea of harmonizing actions between nations. And for many states, they've gone above and beyond their commitments made in the Paris Climate Agreement. So most recently at the 75th session of the General Assembly, Xi Jinping committed to completely decarbonising the Chinese economy by 2060, going way above and beyond any commitment made as part of the Paris Climate Agreements. So that is a huge kind of strength of the UN in being able to coordinate action. Yes, there are still holdouts on that. The India and the US are primarily going to be the kind of the holdouts in any future agreements, but it will be something we need to watch with interest going forward into COP26 next November in Glasgow. So overall, it's really up to you to decide whether you think the UN has truly done anything to achieve its founding objectives as set out in Article 1. And really, I want you to think whether it has, saved humanity from hell rather than taking it to heaven. And just to kind of bring this into the exam focus, there is quite a common question that you get asked around the UN quite frequently, primarily that of evaluate the view that the UN has achieved its founding objectives. So what you'd want to do is you'd want to reference those kind of founding objectives in Article 1, and then use some of those strengths and weaknesses, making sure you're evaluating it back to that specific question. Well, guys, that's it for today. I'm hoping you found this useful as always. If you have any ideas for future videos or topics that you'd like us to cover, please let us know. But I'll say bye for now. Okay, bye, folks.